Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman. This bill is undoubtedly necessary in that what preceded it was interception and surveillance based on something like 66 different legal bases, incomprehensible to almost anybody. And I had hoped that it would have covered all of the previous legal bases. It has not done so. There are still matters not covered by this bill. Indeed, for example, the 1994 Secret Intelligence Service Act is still avowed in this bill and used as a mechanism for which it was not intended. I know that because I took that bill through the House, and I know what it was intended, and it was nothing like what it's now used for. However, since I've got a very limited amount of time, I'll press on, but I'll say this, that listening to many of the speeches, most of the speeches made in this section of the report stage, I agree with virtually all of them, particularly the points about modification, and I think also that the Honourable Lady for Camberwell and my right honourable Lady for Camberwell and my right honourable friend for Gainsborough had a very good point, whatever the mechanism, had a very good point about the flaws in the current Wilson Doctrine as now laid down here. So there are many changes yet to come, and I imagine they'll come in the Lords or indeed in the law courts. But if I can focus briefly in the next few minutes on the amendments in my name, 208 to 211 principally, they deal with the issue of the so-called double lock. Although as it's been represented up until now, until the change today, more like a double latch key, because it's not really as strong as it was laid out to be. Before I go into that, I'll just say that I should tell the House I take the view that the whole interception strategy used by this country is flawed in any event. We are virtually the only serious country in the world that does not use interception in court, in evidence. And the arguments laid before us by the government and the agencies are arguments that could equally be made anywhere else in the world, and no other authority follows that. And because it's not used in court, I think is one of the reasons that we have rather sloppy legal disciplines applying to the use of interception. Now, in particular, that we rely on principally the Home Secretary to authorise them. Now, there are practical reasons, there are principled reasons, there are political reasons, and there are accountability reasons for that being wrong. Just full stop wrong. The practical one is that the Home Secretary has admitted to authorising about 2,500 of these things a year. Now, that's not at most 10 a day, it's on average 10 a day. And when, during the second reading, I asked her to tell us how long she took over any of them, she refused. She sidestepped the answer. When this became public after the Anderson report, I had letters from policemen who were involved in the creation of warrants who said this is simply impossible. This cannot be done 10 a day. A judge could not do 10 a day. So that's the first problem. Second problem is we, of course, take our judgments from the current Home Secretary. Now, she's very unusual. She's been in office for 6 years. That's incredibly unusual. It's a great reflection on her. But actually, a typical Home Secretary is not there for 6 years. I was Shadow Home Secretary for 5 years, and I faced 4 different Home Secretaries. 1.5 years apiece, roughly. So what are we looking at? We have somebody here who's been in office typically for a year or so, making really serious judgments in a real hurry. This is not a way to make the sort of balanced judgments that we expect when we are balancing, on the one hand, the privacy of our citizens, on the other hand, the life and security of our citizens. The second reason is one of principle. I take the view, as indeed I think David Anderson did, that it's perfectly proper for ministers of the Crown to approve anything which would involve, let's say, a foreign intercept, which would create a political problem for the country. I don't see any argument whatsoever, other than the vestiges of royal prerogative, why they should make judgments about warrants brought against citizens of this country. I can see nothing that justifies that. Our greatest ally, America, views it with horror. It causes us problems with American companies when those warrants are presented. And they use a solely legal process, which would be my preference. The arguments of accountability are frankly laughable. I know of no minister who has stood at that dispatch box and defended the issue of a warrant or the non-issue of a warrant. Not once. Not once. The argument, I think, in committee that was put, and indeed it's arguably not legal, but the argument that was put in committee, I think, by the Minister of State was, well, they're accountable to the Intelligence and Security Committee. Now, the current members of the Intelligence and Security Committee include some of my oldest and dearest political friends. But I have to tell you, I would not trust a committee that had to be nominated by the Prime Minister, that met in secret, and whose reports were redacted to hold the executive to account. You know, and I could go into the history of it, of course, where they missed the dodgy dossier, they missed the torture, they missed the mass surveillance, they got 7/7 wrong. This is not a committee you can rely on for accountability. So I'm afraid, even until it's proven itself in many more years. So it shouldn't really be a politician signing this off. We're not going to win that argument today, so what's the next best step? The next best step is that a judicial process based on the evidence, always based on the evidence, not optionally based on the evidence, is the check on this. My preference is that should happen before the Home Secretary actually sees it, not after. That might cut 2,500 down to 2,000. It might make it a little more practical. But the simple truth is that would be a better way in any well-designed system. Now, my amendments were aiming towards improving that. The government has come up with a manuscript amendment today, which the previous DPP says he thinks is acceptable. Until I've taken advice, I can't make a judgment on that, but for that reason, I will not press my amendments today. But I have to say to the front bench that if their arguments on this do not stand up, they will either collapse in the Lords or they will collapse in the law courts, one or the other. And that is pretty certain in my view. I'll just finish by saying this, that there have been a number of other issues raised today in terms of legal privilege, which, as I said, I think is the most important corrosion that's gone on. The Wilson Doctrine we've heard about, journalists, trade unions, and now more widely. One of the things that's come up in the last few years has been the misbehaviour of police forces and agencies with respect to demonstrators, legitimate, proper democratic operations of the Green Movement, for example, the blacklisting that the right honourable gentleman referred to. All of these need to be dealt with, and if the privacy guidance, the privacy clauses now effectively built into the bill do not do it, we will have to find a way of ensuring that we don't just solve the problems of history, we solve the problems of the future.